In July 1944, the war in Normandy seemed to be in a stalemate. For 6 weeks, the Allies had been bashing their heads against the German defensive line. The terrain, the bocage, favored the defender. The ancient hedgerows turned every field into a fortress. The German 7th Army and Panzer Group West had fought brilliantly. They had contained the beachhead. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding the German forces in the West, was worried about attrition, but he felt he had the situation under control. He believed the Americans were bogged down. He believed the British were exhausted around Caen. Reports sent to Berlin emphasized the heavy Allied losses. The enemy attacks, but gains no ground, the reports said. In the Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, thousands of miles away, this news was received with optimism. Hitler believed that the Allied invasion was failing. He believed that the unnatural coalition of Americans and British would break if he could just hold them on the beaches long enough. He saw the stalemate not as a desperate holding action, but as proof of German superiority. He ignored the reality of the supply situation. He ignored the fact that his tanks were running out of fuel and his men were exhausted. He looked at the map and saw a static line. To Hitler, a static line meant stability. It meant he had time. He began to dream of a counterstroke. He began to move divisions on paper, believing that he could throw the Allies back into the sea. He was living in an illusion. The stalemate wasn't a sign of Allied weakness, it was a coiled spring. The Americans weren't stopped, they were building up pressure. And on July 25, that pressure was about to blow the lid off the German defense. The illusion of stability was shattered at 11 a.m. on July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra. The U.S. Army Air Forces unleashed a carpet-bombing attack on a narrow sector of the front near St. Lo. Thousands of bombers dropped tons of high explosives. The German Panzer-led division, an elite unit holding that sector, was vaporized. Tanks were flipped upside down. Bunkers collapsed. The landscape was turned into a moonscape. Through this hole in the line poured the U.S. First Army, and behind them, George Patton's Third Army. The German line didn't just break, it dissolved. American tanks broke out into the open country of Brittany and central France. They were moving fast, 30, 40 miles a day. General von Kluge was in a panic. His left flank had vanished. The Americans were swinging around behind him. He knew military strategy. The only logical move was to retreat. He needed to pull the entire German army back to the Seine River, shorten his lines, and regroup. If he stayed where he was, he would be encircled. He prepared the orders for a general withdrawal. He radioed Berlin, explaining the catastrophe. "The front has collapsed," he reported. "We must save the army." He expected Hitler to understand. He expected permission to retreat. Instead, he got a lecture on courage. Hitler received the news of the breakout not with fear, but with a strange, manic excitement. He didn't look at the disaster on the left flank. He looked at the map and saw something else. He saw an opportunity. Adolf Hitler prided himself on his frontline intuition. He believed he understood war better than his professional generals. Sitting in his bunker, far from the dust and blood of Normandy, he stared at the map. He saw the long, thin finger of the American advance pushing south towards Avranches. Avranches was a coastal town. It was the bottleneck through which all of Patton's supplies had to pass. Hitler's eyes lit up. He ignored the fact that his army was battered. He ignored the Allied air superiority. He saw a geometric shape on the map. "Look," he told General Jodl. "The Americans have extended themselves." He believed the American flank was exposed. "If we strike here," he pointed to the town of Mortain, "we can cut them off." He envisioned a massive armored thrust cutting from east to west, reaching the coast at Avranches. This would sever Patton's Third Army from its supply base. It would trap the Americans in Brittany. Hitler believed this would be the decisive battle of the West. He believed he could destroy the US Army in one bold stroke. He called it the unique opportunity. He began to dictate orders. He wasn't shouting in anger, he was shouting in triumph. He believed he had lured the Americans into a trap. "We must not retreat," he ordered. "We must attack." He ordered Kluge to gather every available Panzer division, the 1st SS, the 2nd SS, the 2nd Panzer, the 116th Panzer. He stripped other sectors of their defenses. He ordered them to turn west and strike at Mortain. To the generals in the bunker, it looked like a bold plan on paper. To the generals in France, it looked like a death sentence. The order reached von Kluge on August 2nd. Operation Lüttich. The field marshal read the message with dread. Hitler's orders were specific and micromanaged. The intention is not merely to stop the American breakout, but to cut off the breakthrough units and destroy them. Hitler demanded a concentrated attack by 8 panzer divisions. He forbade any retreat to the Seine. "The decision in the West depends on this attack," Hitler wrote. Von Kluge tried to argue. He got on the phone with General Jodl. "It is impossible," Kluge said. "My tanks are depleted. We have no air cover. If we move in the open, the J-bows, fighter bombers, will destroy us." He explained that by attacking west, he was sticking his head further into the noose. If the attack failed, the German army would be deep inside the Allied pocket, with no way out. Hitler refused to listen. He accused Kluge of defeatism. He accused the generals of lacking National Socialist order. "The attack will proceed," Hitler insisted. "It must be a surprise. It must happen at night to avoid the aircraft." Hitler was obsessed with the idea of 1940, the swift, decisive armored cut. He didn't understand that 1944 was different. In 1940, the Luftwaffe owned the sky. In 1944, the Allies owned it. He didn't understand that his tanks were running on fumes. Most importantly, he didn't understand that the enemy knew he was coming. Hitler thought he was a genius springing a trap. In reality, he was sending the last remnants of the Panzerwaffe into a meat grinder that the Americans had already prepared. He had said, "This is a unique opportunity." And he was right. It was a unique opportunity for the Allies to destroy the German army in the West. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge was a man-trap between a hammer and an anvil. The hammer was the Allied army crushing his front. The anvil was Adolf Hitler in East Prussia. When the final order for Operation Lüttich arrived, Kluge knew it was a death warrant for his army. He sat in his headquarters, surrounded by maps that showed disaster on every front. His staff officers looked on in silence as the field marshal argued over the phone with OKW, High Command, in Berlin. To attack now is suicide. Kluge yelled. We have no fuel reserves. The divisions are not at full strength. And the moment the sun rises, the enemy air force will blow us off the road. He pleaded for sanity. He explained that every mile his tanks moved west toward Avranches was a mile deeper into the Allied trap. He pointed to the map, showing how Patton was sweeping around his southern flank and the Canadians were pressing from the north. We are putting our heads in the lion's mouth. But the voice on the other end of the line, General Jodl, speaking for Hitler, was unmoved. The Führer's order is final, Jodl said coldly. The attack will proceed. Failure is not an option. The fate of Germany depends on it. Kluge slammed the phone down. He looked pale and exhausted. He was a professional soldier of the old Prussian school. He knew his duty was to obey orders. But he also knew his duty was to preserve his army. Hitler was forcing him to choose. With a heavy heart, Kluge issued the orders to his panzer commanders. He gathered the cream of the remaining German armor in the west, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Das Reich, the 2nd Panzer, and the 116th Panzer. These were proud units, but they were battered shadows of what they had been in June. The commanders were grim. They knew the reality on the ground. It's a desperate gamble, SS General Hauser noted. Kluge knew it wasn't a gamble. A gamble implies a chance of winning. This was a sacrifice. He was throwing his last reserves into an attack he didn't believe in, led by a man who was thousands of miles away and refusing to look at reality. The attack began in the dead of night on August 7, 1944. To avoid the deadly Allied fighter bombers, the German columns moved without headlights. Hundreds of Panthers, Tigers, and assault guns rumbled through the narrow, foggy lanes of the Bocage, heading west toward the town of Mortain. Their objective was Avranches and the sea, 20 miles away. Initial progress was good. They achieved total surprise against the American units in the sector, elements of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. The Germans overran American roadblocks in the dark. They captured the town of Mortain before dawn. For a few hours, it seemed like Hitler's intuition might be right. German morale soared briefly. The crews felt the familiar surge of the offensive. They were moving forward again, not just retreating. The spearheads pushed 5, 6, 7 miles into the American lines. They were cutting across the supply lines of Patton's Third Army. In the bunker in East Prussia, the initial reports were greeted with jubilation. The Americans are reeling. Hitler declared, "We have them." He urged Kluge to push harder. Commit the reserves. Drive to the sea. But the German commanders on the ground knew the truth. They were watching the clock. Every minute that ticked by brought the sunrise closer. They knew that their success depended entirely on darkness and fog. As dawn broke over the hills around Mortain, the fog began to lift. The German tank commanders popped their hatches and looked up anxiously at the brightening sky. They weren't looking for American artillery, they were looking for the RAF and the USAF. The gamble had been based on the hope of a few days of bad weather. But the sky on the morning of August 7th was clear, blue, and terrifyingly empty of clouds. The German army was strung out along miles of open road, deep in enemy territory, perfectly visible from the air. The trap was sprung. What Hitler didn't know, what he couldn't possibly believe, was that the Americans were waiting for him. The unique opportunity was a trap that General Omar Bradley had set, baiting it with his own exposed flank. How did Bradley know? Ultra. The Allies had broken the German Enigma code. They were reading Hitler's orders almost as fast as his own generals. When Hitler ordered the concentration of panzer divisions for the attack on Mortain, the messages were intercepted by British listening stations, decoded at Bletchley Park, and flashed to Eisenhower and Bradley in France. Bradley read the decrypts in his trailer. He saw the exact German plan, the units involved, the timing, the objective. A lesser general might have panicked. The German attack was aimed right at the thinnest part of his line. But Bradley saw the bigger picture. He realized that Hitler was doing exactly what the Allies wanted. By attacking west, the Germans were shoving their head further into a pocket. Bradley made a cold, calculated decision. He would not reinforce the Mortain sector heavily. He would leave it thin, bait for the trap. He ordered the 30th Infantry Division to hold Mortain at all costs. They would be the speed bump. While the Germans were busy attacking Mortain, Bradley ordered Patton to keep going south and then turn east, swinging around behind the German army. He ordered the Canadians and British in the north to push south. He was creating a massive bag, and Hitler was voluntarily marching his army into it. Bradley later said of the German attack, "It was an opportunity that comes to a commander not more than once in a century." Hitler thought he was the master strategist, surprising the naive Americans. In reality, his every move was known, his orders were anticipated, and his army was being guided to its destruction by an enemy who read his mail. The success of Bradley's trap depended on one thing: the Germans had to be stopped at Mortain. If they broke through to Avranches, they would cause chaos in the American rear. The task of stopping the SS Panzers fell to the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. They dug in on a key piece of high ground just east of Mortain known as Hill 314. It was a rocky, wooded hill that commanded a view of the entire area. On the morning of August 7th, they were surrounded. The German 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich swarmed around the hill. They captured the town below and cut off the American battalion. For 5 days, the lost battalion held out. There were about 700 men on the hill. They had limited ammunition, little food, and almost no medical supplies. The only water source was a muddy spring targeted by German snipers. The Germans attacked the hill repeatedly. They used tanks, artillery, and infantry assaults. They knew that as long as the Americans held Hill 314, their artillery observers could call down fire on the roads leading to Avranches. The German advance was paralyzed. SS officers shouted surrender demands in English. The American commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hardaway, later captured, and then Captain Ralph Curley, refused. They fought with desperate courage. They used bazookas to hold off tanks at point-blank range. They called down artillery fire on their own positions to break up German attacks. They were resupplied by air drops, although many of the pallets drifted into German lines. They held the rock. Hill 314 became the breakwater against which the German armored tide smashed itself. Hitler's grand strategy, his unique opportunity, was stopped cold not by a massive armored counterattack, but by a single stubborn battalion of American infantry unwilling to budge from a hill in France. Their sacrifice bought the time needed for the rest of the Allied armies to close the jaws of the trap. By the afternoon of August 7, the German counterattack at Mortain had stalled against the stubborn resistance of the American infantry on Hill 314. Then, the weather cleared completely. The fog burnt off, revealing a brilliant, cloudless summer sky. For the German tankers exposed on the roads around Mortain, it was the sky of death. The Allied Tactical Air Forces, the RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force and the USAF 9th Air Force, had been waiting for this moment. They pounced. Hundreds of fighter bombers, British Hawker Typhoons and American PF-47 Thunderbolts descended on the German columns. The Germans called them Jabos, Jag Bomber, and they terrified them more than any Allied tank. The RAF Typhoons were armed with RP-3 rockets, 60-pound high-explosive warheads mounted under the wings. A Typhoon could unleash a salvo equal to a destroyer's broadside. The attacks were relentless. The pilots didn't have to search for targets, the roads were jammed with German armor that had nowhere to hide. Tanks exploded. Fuel trucks turned into fireballs, blocking the narrow lanes and trapping the vehicles behind them. The carnage was absolute. German crews bailed out of intact Panthers and Tigers, abandoning them because to stay inside a stalled tank under that sky was suicide. General von Kluge's prediction had come true. His armored fist had been smashed from the air before it could land its punch. By the evening of August 7, Operation Luttage was effectively dead. The German offensive capability in the West had been broken not in a great tank battle, but by swarms of aircraft that turned the pride of the Panzerwaffe into burning scrap metal on the roadside. Back in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the mood was delusional. Hitler refused to believe the reports coming from the front. He dismissed the Allied air attacks as temporary setbacks. When von Kluge reported that the attack had failed and begged permission to withdraw to save what was left of the army, Hitler flew into a rage. He didn't see a defeated army, he saw cowardly generals. The attack failed because it was launched too early. Hitler shouted at his staff. It failed because Kluge is a defeatist. On August 8 and 9, instead of ordering a retreat, Hitler doubled down. He ordered Kluge to renew the attack. He ordered more reserves, units that barely existed, to be thrown into the Mortain sector. He was obsessed with the map, with the geometric idea of cutting off the Americans. He was completely divorced from the reality of mud, blood, and air superiority. Every hour that Hitler forced the German 7th Army to remain in the Mortain salient was an hour that the Allied trap tightened around them. The German generals on the ground, Hauser, Eberbach, Dietrich, knew they were doomed. They could see the Americans sweeping around their southern flank and the British pressing from the north. They knew the only sane military option was an immediate, full-speed retreat to the Seine River. But they were paralyzed by their oath to the Führer. Kluge, caught between his professional judgment and his fear of Hitler, cracked under the pressure. He tried to organize the renewed attack, knowing it was impossible. Hitler's refusal to look at reality had transformed a tactical defeat into an existential crisis for the Wehrmacht in the West. He was holding his army in place so the Allies could kill it. By August 12, even Hitler couldn't ignore the map. The unique opportunity had become a unique disaster. Because the Germans had pushed west to Mortain, they had thrust themselves deep into a pocket. To the north, the Canadians and Poles were fighting hard, pushing south toward the town of Falaise. To the south, Patton's Third Army, having raced unopposed through the open French countryside, had turned north. The US 15 Corps seized the town of Argentan. The trap was visible on any map. Between Falaise in the north and Argentan in the south, there was a gap of only about 15 miles. Inside this rapidly shrinking pocket were 100,000 German soldiers, thousands of vehicles, and all the remaining heavy weapons of the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. The neck of the bag was closing. Inside the pocket, chaos reigned. Units were mixed up. Command and control broke down. The roads were clogged with a desperate mass of humanity trying to escape east. Still, Hitler hesitated. He finally authorized a minor withdrawal, but it was too little, too late. He still dreamed of holding the line in Normandy. The Allied commanders, Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Bradley, argued about how to close the gap. Bradley halted Patton at Argentan, fearful of a friendly fire incident with the Canadians coming from the north. This controversial delay kept the gap open for a few more days, allowing some Germans to escape. But for the vast majority, the delay didn't matter. They were moving too slowly, encumbered by horse-drawn artillery and lack of fuel. They were trapped in a cauldron of fire, with the lid slowly screwing shut. By August 16, the retreat had become a rout. Hitler finally authorized a full withdrawal, but the orders were meaningless. The army was dissolving. The final act played out in the corridor of death near the village of Chamboy and the slopes of Mont-Ormel, held by the brave Polish 1st Armored Division. The gap narrowed to a few hundred yards, swept by Allied artillery and aircraft. It was a slaughter. German columns, desperate to escape, ran a gauntlet of fire. Horses stampeded. Trucks burned. Men were mowed down in the open fields. When the gap finally closed on August 21, the Battle of Normandy was over. The destruction was apocalyptic. Eisenhower, touring the battlefield later, wrote that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards stepping only on dead bodies and wrecked equipment. 50,000 Germans were captured in the pocket. 10,000 died. The roads were choked with the bloated corpses of horses and the twisted wreckage of the once mighty panzer divisions. The German army in the West had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The verdict of history is clear. The Normandy breakout could have been a manageable German defeat. If they had retreated to the Seine in July, they might have established a new defensive line and prolonged the war. Instead, it became a catastrophe. And the author of that catastrophe was Adolf Hitler. His arrogance, his amateurish reliance on intuition over professional advice, and his fanatical refusal to give up ground doomed his own army. When he saw the breakout begin, he said, "This is a unique opportunity." He was wrong. It was the beginning of the end of the Third Reich.